So we have to choose healing. We have to choose healing because healing is how we honor God. We're honoring him by saying that I value what you value. God values the vessel more than he values the outcome. He values the vessel because it is the vessel that he uses to advance his kingdom. We overcame the enemy by the blood of the Lamb and the words of their testimonies. We are called to build the kingdom. The vessel has to build the kingdom. That is what God values. So when we choose to heal, we honor God by saying, I value what you value. And I will not use spirituality to bypass being whole. Hey, it's your girl Dorcas, and welcome back to the Dorcas Pittman podcast, where I am on this journey of empowering her to drop the cape and heal for real. This is the space where courage, clarity, and strategy meets real healing. So this week's episode is all about love. It's about loving yourself enough to heal and what that really means. What it means to love yourself enough to heal. You know, we talk about healing, but one thing we don't talk about enough is why people resist it. They resist it, but they also walk around praying and asking God to take it away, to heal them, to relieve them of the pain, to heal whatever brokenness they have. But they walk around with all that and still resist healing. And that is something that we don't talk about. But here's the thing. Loving yourself enough to heal means that you finally stop agreeing that you are survival and that survival is your only identity. That's what it means. It means that you come out of alignment with the identity of survival and fully embrace the identity of freedom, of who God created you to be. And I realize that some of us don't avoid healing because we don't believe it. We avoid it because if we're honest with ourselves, deep down, we don't believe that we're worth the work. We don't believe we're worth the work. We believe we're too far gone. We believe we're not worthy. And that's the furthest thing from God. That's the furthest thing from love. So before we jump into talking about what it means to love ourselves enough to heal, I just want to be clear that this is not about being self-centered or self-absorbed. It's all about honoring yourself and being aligned with who God created you to be. Because this is the why behind the work. Why healing is an act of love, of stewardship, and obedience, and is never an act of weakness. It's never a weakness. So like I said, loving yourself enough to heal is not being overly obsessed with yourself. It's not self-absorption. It is more so about self-responsibility. Being responsible for yourself and not abandoning you. For a long time, we have been committed to surviving, to performing, to producing, to building, but not to healing. We kept showing up for everyone else while we were quietly abandoning ourselves. And that's just the truth. That's just us being honest. Like day in and day out, so many people abandon themselves to fully throw everything that they have into other people, into other things. And then we have the audacity to call it strength. We have the audacity to call it strength. But there comes a moment in our lives, and I encountered that moment. I had that moment when God tells us that we don't need to prove anything to anyone, that we don't have to keep performing, that we don't have to keep going and burning the candle at both ends. All we need to do is be honest, be open, be free, be willing to do the work to be free. And this episode is all about that moment you stop asking for permission to heal and realize you've always had permission to heal. You've always had permission to heal. Because healing is not something you earn after you get your life together, after you started the business, after you've created the family. Healing is not something you earn. Healing is stewardship of the life God entrusted you with when He told you to exist, when He told you to be. That's what healing is. That's what it is. And you realize that when you stop normalizing your pain by calling it discipline, you will begin to love yourself. You begin to love yourself more. You're not loving yourself is not you saying, "Oh, I am disciplined to deal with the pain. I know what it takes. I'm focused and I can deal with the pain." That's not loving yourself. God never told you to be intentional about always being in pain. That's not what God told us to do. That is not discipline. That is survival. So when I talk about loving yourself enough to heal, I think about Matthew 22:9 when it says, "Love your neighbor as yourself." And it brings me back to how can we effectively do relationship well by loving our neighbor when we're constantly abandoning ourselves, when we're not loving ourselves, when we're not stewarding ourselves. And that may be why community and building relationships and why the world is the way it is. Because there are so many people who are holding resentment and frustration because they have poured all they have into other people and they never took the time to love and care for themselves. That part. And that's something I've experienced. I was so busy pouring into and loving on and doing all the things for everybody else, but it wasn't being reciprocated. But how can I expect someone to do it for me when I don't do it for myself? How can I love your neighbor as yourself when I don't love myself? When I'm not stewarding me well? When I've abandoned me? And here's the thing, you can't love well what you secretly neglect. You can't love well what you secretly neglect. We secretly neglect ourselves. We neglect our emotions. We neglect our feelings. We neglect our well-beings. We neglect our mental capacities. We neglect our hearts. We neglect ourselves in every capacity sometimes. So how can we love well? How can we love our friends, our partners, our employees or whoever? How can you love them well when you secretly neglect yourself? You see, this episode I need you to get the importance of loving yourself enough. I need you to understand what that means, what it looks like, and how freeing it is. Because if you don't start loving yourself, who knows where you're going to end up? This is the vessel that God gave you to do the work, but you don't love it. You're not stewarding it. So here's the thing. Survival is not the same as love. It's not the same as love. I've said before, many of us didn't choose survival. It was learned behavior. And some women were taught by their mothers, their grandmothers, their great grandmothers. They were actually trained how to survive. They weren't taught how to love themselves. They were taught how to survive. They were trained to survive no matter what. And see, survival taught us how to stay alert, how to push through, how to keep functioning, even when we were exhausted, even when we're hurting, even when we're overwhelmed. Because survival says we just have to get through the day. I just have to get through the day. I just have to get through the day. And that may work for a season, but that is not going to work for a lifetime. It's not going to work in the next season or the next season, especially if you desire to grow, especially if you desire for God to put you in those spaces and places that He's shown you. You can't just keep getting through the day. That's not life. That's not living your most abundant life. That's not living at all. That is bondage. That's not freedom. That's survival. And one thing survival never did was taught us how to take care of ourselves. It taught you how to override or disregard your needs. It taught you how to silence your emotions and to keep moving. And even when something inside of you was breaking, even when you were at your breaking point, you kept moving because survival told you you had to. But here's the truth. You can't survive. You can survive without ever feeling safe. You can survive without being honest. You can even survive while completely disconnected from yourself. You can survive with all of that. You know how many people are out here surviving and have never experienced what real safety feels like? They're out here surviving, but they're not honest with themselves. They're out here surviving, but they're completely disconnected with who they are. And healing requires something that this constant survival mode will never value. And that is gentleness instead of urgency, honesty instead of avoidance, and consistency instead of always being in a flight or fight mode. That's what healing requires. And none of those things are taught or experienced when you're constantly in survival mode. Because survival asks, how can I make it? How do I make it? But loving yourself will say, what do I need to be well? What do I need to feel better, to be whole? What do I need? And loving yourself enough to heal is realizing that the coping mechanisms that once protected you may now be the very thing that's keeping you where you are. And that was my experience. That was my experience. Those coping mechanisms, they got me through a season, but where I am today and where I'm going, they could not stay. I could no longer just cope. I had to heal in order to be able to do, in order to have the capacity to do, in order to have the wherewithal, mentally, emotionally, and spiritually, to be, to do, to go, to build. So I couldn't afford to stay stuck. Healing is a boundary. Healing is a boundary. That part. And we know how hard it is for some of us to set boundaries. But this is where it gets real. This is where, like, it's what we're gonna do. Because loving yourself enough to heal means you stop letting pain be the price of access. Access to your time, access to your emotions, access to your body, access to your spirit, access to you as a leader. Like, that's what healing yourself, you begin to set those boundaries. I have a saying that access to me is a privilege, and not out of arrogance. It's me saying that if God allows you to have access to me, then it is to be honored. It is to be honored. It is not for you to hurt me. It is not for you to abuse me, to misuse me. So if God gives me access to people, I honor it. Because he has allowed our paths to align for a reason. And so we have to stop letting pain be the price for our time, the price for our existence, the price for everything that is attached to us. And for far too long, we've proven, like, we've had to prove our strength through our silence. Like, oh, I'm strong. I'm just going to deal with it. I'm just going to hold it all in. I'm just not going to talk about it. No, you're not going to just deal with it. No, you are not a burden to other people. No, you're going to heal now. Because that silence is the complete opposite. That silence tells you, oh, I'll just deal with it. Or I don't want to be a burden to anyone. Or I got my whole life to heal. I don't have to deal it now. But God gave you the opportunity to heal today. And what if you healing today will open the door to a life more abundantly tomorrow? What if? But when you choose to remain silent, it costs you your peace. See, stop confusing silence with strength. You're not being strong by just suffering in silence. No, it's not. That's not strength. That is the cost of your peace. That is the cost of your peace of mind. That is the cost of your rested nights. That is the cost you're paying by suffering in silence and masking it as strength. But the boundary of healing tells us that I will not keep bleeding to make others comfortable. I will not keep bleeding to make others comfortable. I will not normalize what God is trying to heal. And I will not confuse endurance with obedience. Some of you are just enduring life. Some of you are just enduring pain. Some of you are just enduring brokenness. When God has told you to heal, when God has told you to let those relationships go, when God has told you to move, you've chose to endure. That's not self-love. That's not loving yourself. It's not. And this is the space where that shame, pride, and fear creeps in that I talked about last week, because shame will tell you that you're not worthy of, that you're not worthy enough to take care of yourself, that you're unworthy of being cared for. Pride will tell you that you don't need help, that you are good by yourself, that you're going to continue to bleed out and continue to make other people comfortable while you are in pain. And fear tells you that healing will cost you too much. Can I tell you something? Healing has cost me nothing. Compared to what my pain cost me, healing has cost me nothing. My pain, my suffering in silence cost me more than my healing ever did. Because Jesus paid the price for my healing. But me enduring, instead of being obedient, instead of loving myself, instead of speaking my truth, it cost me so much. But I love that even though the pain, the suffering in silence cost me so much, because I chose to heal, God is the Redeemer. God is the Restorer. He is. And I had to remember or stay grounded in the fact that loving myself enough to heal means that I'm worth whatever it takes. I'm worth the time, and I'm even worth the discomfort of the change. Because healing is uncomfortable. It can be uncomfortable, but I'm worth it. I'm worth whatever it takes to be free. Healing is worth whatever it takes to be free. It's whatever it takes to be free. But one of the most important things I want you to understand is healing honors God. And what I'm about to say may ruffle some feathers, and I'm okay with that. But healing honors God, because God didn't ask us to sacrifice our souls to fulfill the assignment that He put on our lives. Why? He cares about the vessel, not just the outcome. He cares about us as the person, not just the ministries we build. He cares about us as the vessel, not just about the lives we impact. He cares about the vessel, the body, the mind, the spirit, the emotions. He cares about our capacity. Because when you're holding on to all of this past weight, you don't have the capacity to really fulfill the assignment. So here's the thing. You're not more spiritual because you're bleeding quietly, because you're suffering in silence. That doesn't make you more spiritual. And that has been the problem in ministry. That has been the problem in the pulpit. That has been the problem. Because you have so many leaders who are bleeding out, and they are masking it by saying that they're more spiritual because Jesus suffered. Yes, He suffered. Okay. But you bleeding and suffering in silence does not make you more spiritual, because if you don't deal with the bleeding, you're going to bleed on the people that God has attached to you. You're not more anointed because you're exhausted. You're not more anointed because you're exhausted, because you're traveling from city to city, singing, worshiping, preaching, teaching, doing whatever, building. You're not more anointed because you're exhausted. God rested. And the anointing flows from him. And you're not more faithful because you're ignoring the warning signs, because you're ignoring the triggers, because you're ignoring the exhaustion, because you're ignoring the emotional dysfunction. That doesn't make you more faithful. It doesn't. It doesn't. Because some of what some of what we are calling faith is actually us really neglecting the assignment, neglecting the vessel, neglecting us. We're neglecting rest, we're neglecting to be honest, we're neglecting boundaries, we are neglecting the very body that God entrusted us to use to fulfill the assignment. So we have to choose healing. We have to choose healing because healing is how we honor God. We're honoring him by saying that I value what you value. God values the vessel more than he values the outcome. He values the vessel because it is the vessel that he uses to advance his kingdom. We overcame the enemy by the blood of the Lamb and the words of their testimonies. We are called to build the kingdom. The vessel has to build the kingdom. That is what God values. So when we choose to heal, we honor God by saying, I value what you value. And I will not use spirituality to bypass being whole. I will not be this overly holier than thou, super spiritual person who and that overrides me being broken. That overrides me not dealing with my past pain, my past hurts, my past hangups. That's not me dealing with this mess that I'm carrying. And it says that I will not build what you've called me to build on a broken foundation. Build whole. Because when you start building and your foundation is whole, your mind, your body, and your spirit is whole, you're going to build whole. Because you're not tired, you're not exhausted, you're setting boundaries, you're not over spiritualizing everything. That's how you honor God. You don't glorify God by breaking yourself. You glorify him by stewarding yourself. You glorify God by stewarding yourself. By loving yourself enough to heal. So this week, like we do always, we have to affirm ourselves. We have to speak life into ourselves. And here's your affirmation of the week. I am allowed to heal without explaining myself. I am allowed to choose myself without guilt. And I love myself enough to heal. I am allowed to heal without explaining myself. I am allowed to choose myself without guilt. And I love myself enough to heal. So as we wrap things up, I want you to just understand that you don't need to become someone else to deserve healing. You just need to stop abandoning yourself and start listening to yourself. Start stewarding yourself. Start spending time with yourself. And I want you to understand, more importantly, that loving yourself enough to heal isn't selfish, it's stewardship. And it's the moment you stop surviving what God is trying to restore. It is the decision to no longer build your life, your leadership, or your legacy on unhealed wounds. And always remember that you don't need more permission. You don't need more proof. You don't need to suffer to be worthy. If God cares about the vessel, then healing isn't optional. It's obedience. If God cares about the vessel, and we know that He does, then healing isn't optional. It's obedience. So as you are choosing to love yourself enough to heal, I want you to remember that you are already hurt. You are healed, you are empowered, and you are restored. Until next week, I'll talk to you soon. Peace.